again have that slight problem of being supremely unsurprised. Whatever sleaze or cronyism or corruption or seediness emerges from this Vote Leave cabal at the heart of our government, I will not be surprised. I don't even think I can be shocked. I can't think of anything that could come out that would make me go, wow, I didn't think they'd stoop that low. So I've got a massive problem in the context of news, because I try to think, how would you feel if this was not a government led by a man whose history of lying stands up to, all comers, world-beating, I think we could all agree, couldn't we? We can't disagree with that. And that's why people have ended up in this really tragic position of saying, I love it, because it upsets people like you. Yeah, it's great when I get lied to, because people who like the truth get so upset about it. And you think I'm exaggerating or joking. It's millions of people. Millions of people have ended up in this position. Why do you think they keep wanging on about flags and culture wars? They don't want you to look at facts and policies, figures and statistics. They just want you to identify another bogus enemy and spend your life attacking them. And it works. That's the point. And none of us can dispute it works really, really well. And it culminates in events like the ones we saw in Washington on the 6th of January. I mean, truly chilling events for any country, let alone a supposedly liberal democracy. But the reason I mention my frustration is because it's so unrelenting. You know, I want now to talk about the relationship between the Prime Minister and his ethics advisor. But of course, I'm not talking about the relationship between a Prime Minister and a ethics advisor. I'm talking about the relationship between this Prime Minister and any ethics advisor. So the Independent Advisor on Ministers' Interests position has been vacant since last November. I can't believe anybody who listens to this programme on a passing basis needs to know, or needs me to tell them, why that position has been vacant since last November. But I'll tell you anyway, because you still hear and read people claiming that at Sir Alexander Allen's investigation into bullying allegations levelled against Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, who of course got fired from her last job after lying to Theresa May. The investigation concluded that her behaviour, and I quote, amounted to behaviour that can be described as bullying. Boris Johnson flushed it down his Lulu Little lavatory, and as a result of that, the Independent Advisor on Ministerial Ethics, the Ministerial Code, resigned. And the position hasn't been filled. So December, January, February, March, and most of April, the position was not filled. That tells you everything you need to know about Boris Johnson's reverence for ethics. And if you want, you can now insert the joke about people with a lisp describing the English county, because that is what Boris Johnson thinks ethics is. And yet, of course, it's an untenable position, even with his astonishing impunity from scrutiny and his, as we've expressed, this magnificent achievement of his by making people think that somehow they're the winners when they get lied to. Even he can't stretch that to Trumpian levels, thank God, because we have the rule of law and we have constitutional norms for now, although we are obviously talking about the Prime Minister who prorogued Parliament unlawfully, who misled the Queen, who's prepared to break international law explicitly. So, you know, the idea that our norms are somehow safer or more solid than the American ones were is perhaps a little naive. But he couldn't get away with this. He had to appoint one eventually, especially given the couple of weeks he's just had. There were lots of reports that he had approached people and they'd said no. So Lord Geit, who's a crossbencher, he's not a Tory peer, former private secretary to the Queen, has accepted the job. But it emerged immediately that a gentleman called David Evans, who's the chair of the Standards Committee, had expressed a desire that the advisor would have powers to launch their own investigation. Boris Johnson has already overruled him. I can't believe that these words will land in some of the ears of some of the people listening to this programme as anything other than outrageous. But the problem is that you never needed to point this out before, because you never had a Prime Minister who would flush a report by the independent advisor on the ministerial code down the toilet in order to protect a cabinet minister that had been fired from the last cabinet for lying to the last prime minister. That's just one example of how mad everything is becoming in our country. And yet, of course, I know you love it because it upsets people like me. I just run through those words again. You never would have even had a conversation about this before because you never would have contemplated the possibility, let alone the established reality, of a serving Prime Minister flushing a report from his own independent advisor on the ministerial code down his Lulu Little lavatory rather than fire the Home Secretary who got fired by the last Prime Minister from her last ministerial position for conducting secret negotiations with a foreign government and then lying about it to the last Prime Minister. On what possible planet would you arrive in Downing Street and think, I must promote her? But we have to have this conversation because it's him. So Boris Johnson will retain the power to exonerate himself of any possible breach of the ministerial code, including over the flat refurbishment. I don't know what the Electoral Commission's relationship with this process is, but if Lord Geit, the newly appointed advisor on ethics, concludes that Boris Johnson has behaved abominably or in direct contravention of the ministerial code, or even perhaps illegally, over this flat refurbishment, Boris Johnson retains the power to turn around and say, no, I haven't, folks, carry on, ha, 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 jolly hockey sticks. And I just don't get that anymore. It seems astonishing to me. The Standards Committee has reported on this. It's submitted. These are cross-party organisations that are the checks and balances upon our executive from within the legislature. And they have stated that there should be new arrangements in place to provide the degree of independence and transparency that the committee believes is necessary. That's David Evans. Lord Evans wrote to Boris Johnson. We note that the advisor will still lack the authority to initiate investigations. We will want to consider how far the new arrangements provide the degree of independence and transparency that the committee believes is necessary. So he can't mount an investigation unless Boris Johnson gives him permission. And if he comes back as a result of that investigation and says, Boris Johnson, you're bang to rights, Boris Johnson can simply say, no, I'm not, off you trot. Which are pretty much the circumstances in which the last lad resigned. How? Does this on any level make sense? And what question do I ask you now? Is there any point in having an ethics advisor if the Prime Minister is free to completely ignore their findings? 0345 6060 973. Hit the numbers now. You will get through. Well, you won't, actually, because we're still chock-a-blocker with people waiting to talk about John Lewis. Can we politely get rid of a couple of those? I'll take a couple more calls on John Lewis, but I want to free up some phone lines for the bigger question. I don't get it. I mean, yesterday, 2 hours on what it is about this particular Prime Minister that prompts people to turn off their moral compasses and you know, a broad and intelligent conversation, and then one poor soul who's rung in to say Donald Trump did win the general election. I've read on Facebook that you've been on suicide watch, James O'Brien, and Boris Johnson is doing a great job, and you just find yourself despairing at the idea of people who genuinely believe this stuff. So apart from that sort of mutton-headed, that's not kind, but it's fair, that sort of mutton-headed stubbornness, that self-harming delusion, who can possibly defend the idea that Boris Johnson's ethics advisor can be overruled by Boris Johnson on investigations into the ethics displayed by Boris Johnson? It's insane. And I'll tell you why it reminds me of Donald Trump, and I'm more than open to criticism of these parallels. I think they're becoming harder to resist. But I'll tell you why it reminds me of Donald Trump. It reminds me of Donald Trump because there's a theory of government, actually, which is called something like the good chap government. I know that's a bit sexist, but there is an idea that you don't need to have these sort of rules in place because the idea of somebody arriving in high office who wouldn't automatically and naturally avoid the kind of behaviour prevented by those rules is unthinkable. Do you see what I mean? So you don't have to have a rule that would make it illegal or punishable for a president of the United States to claim that you can cure coronavirus by sticking a torch down your throat or drinking detergent. Do you see what I mean? It's like this theory that in order to get into that position, I hope I've understood this correctly, I'm sure you'll correct me if I haven't, but in order to get into this position, you must have displayed at least the basic premises of probity and decency. That means we don't actually need a law that says that the Prime Minister isn't allowed to pick the pocket of the Chancellor when he's bending over the drinks fridge. Do you see what I mean? And this Prime Minister clearly drives a coach and horses through all of those presumptions. He would happily break international law. He would happily send Jacob Rees-Mogg to mislead the Queen. He would happily prorogue Parliament unlawfully. So all of the rules don't exist to prevent him doing the things that he does, because it was never contemplated in the constitutional history of these islands, it was never contemplated that a Prime Minister would even contemplate doing the things that Boris Johnson does 6 times before the rest of us have had breakfast. So the needs for independent checks and balances, independent advisors, independent counsel is greater than it has ever been in our island's history, because we have put somebody in Downing Street who does all the things that our unwritten constitution considered it impossible for a Prime Minister to even contemplate doing. And what's his response? Well, I'll appoint a bloke, but I'll retain the right to overrule him. Ha! That'll teach him. So, yeah, go on, off you go. Go and do an investigation. Bring me back the results. If I don't like them, I'll flush it down the Lulu Little toilet, where it will nestle in the sewers of Westminster alongside the report that concluded Priti Patel was indeed a bully. And you love it because it upsets people like me. It's just, I mean, funny on one level. Utterly incomprehensible on another. I don't think it's fair to say, what do you get in return? An invitation to be racist again. But it's all I've got. I'm sorry. I'm sure that's very, very unfair to some people who think Boris Johnson is none of the things that all of the evidence tells us he is. But that's the question. I'd love to hear it. What is the point of having an independent advisor on ethics if you are allowed to overrule his findings? 03456060973 is the number you need. It's 11:16, and do call in on this, because otherwise we're taking John Lewis all the way up till 12. 19 after 11, and I'm sorry, but I think it's a rhetorical question. How can you not care about this? How can you not care about the fact that a Prime Minister who rides roughshod over all norms and conventions, right up to and including international law and misleading the Queen, should be allowed to overrule anybody appointed to examine the ethics of his behaviour? Boy. Prit's in Kirkcudbright. Prit, what would you like to say?
Good morning. Kakubri, remarkably enough.
The problem is that I operate such a friendly and warm working atmosphere with my colleagues. I didn't want to say, would you put in brackets how I pronounce that? Kakubri. There we go.
Yeah, I think the Scots make it up just to confuse the English.
No, there's plenty of that the other way around as well.
Well, indeed. I'm just as staggered as you at the thought of anyone being the ultimate arbiter of their own choice. But what I find really quite unsettling is the manner in which it passes without any real comment other than on shows like yours. For example, all of the furore in recent weeks over the sturgeon salmon affair, which dominated news, certainly up here in Scotland and indeed on places like the BBC website.
Yes, you're right, and the Spectator didn't write about anything else for a month. That's obviously hyperbole.
And if Sturgeon had reserved to herself the right to be the ultimate arbiter, you can just imagine the howls of protest from the mainstream media, and yet they accept Johnson's right to overrule anything without even noticing that it's actually happening. There does appear to be more than a whiff of double standards about this. But I think that you've actually touched on a lot of what I was going to say anyway, which is this whole mindset of somebody who regards themselves as not bound by the same rules as everybody else.
Yes.
There's that quote from Johnson's school teacher in a school report saying that he just doesn't regard himself as being required to do what everyone else has to do.
But imagine if 52% of his classmates felt the same, that they should have to abide by these rules, but he shouldn't. That's the national picture we've got at the moment that I find so baffling.
Well, quite. And it reminds me, I'm a retired GP, and it reminds me of a family that I had in my care who had an extraordinary ability just to invent stuff, and they didn't really see it as a lie. They did, and if they weren't getting what they wanted or satisfying you, they would just invent another lie. And they just lived in this completely different world where events were very elastic and flexible. And after a while, you just sort of stop arguing with them because you realise that there's just no, you can't say, no, hold on, last week you told me this or that, because as far as they were concerned, they hadn't. And I often wonder whether, Johnson perhaps has a similar ability simply to ignore stuff that has happened.
He by force of
himself.
He chooses what he wants to be true, regardless of reality, and by force of personality, somehow persuades people around him that it's true as well. And that is Donald Trump, isn't it? I mean, that is people still claiming that the election was stolen from him when. I don't even have the words to describe how dumb that is, and yet people choose to believe it.
That's right. And to touch on the conversation that you were having yesterday and on why people tolerate this behaviour and why they continue to support, there are so many nuances to that. But I can't help but feel that much as with Trump, there is a group of people, certainly within the UK, maybe a majority, who knows, who have invested so much in the Brexit project, etc., that they cannot now question the person who has delivered that on anything, because if you start unpicking one part, you then have to unpick the rest. And that then sort of ties them into following this person through thick and thin. And so you get, some of the right-wing commentators in America doing the most extraordinary gymnastics to try to justify what Trump has said or done. Because if they question this, they have to question everything.
And that perhaps explains this weird reverse Schadenfreude, where people are discombobulated by the damage done to people who've been lied to, and the people who've been lied to relish and revel in the discombobulation of the people who are outraged on their behalf. So I love it when that is incredible, because you mentioned Brexit, and you will remember, I suspect, Prit, that fish was supposed to be one of the very, very few areas, once the reality had kicked in, fish and blue passports was pretty much what was left at the end of the process that people insisted made Brexit worthwhile. Thank God that the DEFRA Select Committee hasn't just reported that since January, businesses exporting seafood and meat to the European Union have faced substantial new red tape requirements and checks at the border, known as non-tariff barriers. Many of these so-called teething problems are now being resolved, but the new non-tariff barriers introduced by Brexit continue to hinder business, in particular SMEs, exporting seafood and meat to the EU. So these are the moments that I find almost incomprehensible, because I presumed that the fish would at least be, even after everything else had fallen apart, fish was supposed to still be swimming.
Indeed, and the seafood industry here in Scotland has been devastated by this, and it just makes you wonder, if fish was such an iconic and important part of negotiations, and we've ended up with this sort of damage. Can you imagine how bad it would have been if it hadn't been iconic?
Who knows? And you mentioned Scotland. It is indeed the Scotland Food and Drink CEO James Withers, who is on Twitter bringing all of this to our attention. Brexit pain for food exporters is real and ongoing. It threatens viability of many businesses. And crucially, the UK government has to go back to the negotiating table to remove trade barriers. And that statement from the Scottish food and drink industry, or the Scottish food and drink lobby, I have tweeted earlier this morning. And that's it, isn't it, really? I mean, I can read you a few texts saying, I love it, drink those liberal tears or whatever it is. But, I mean, we know you exist. We met one of you live on the programme yesterday. It was illuminating in a million different ways. 3 people prepared to swear on oath. Oh, no, don't believe that. Read something about James on the Facebook page that I'm not prepared to divulge. Oh, yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And you just sort of think, what's the antidote to this level of intoxication or poisoning? And then, as Prit reminds us, you look at America and you think maybe there isn't one. Maybe there just isn't one. Which, under any rational analysis, makes the need for an independent ethics advisor with teeth are inarguable, and yet presumably you don't think Boris Johnson should be subject to the same rules that everybody else is. I don't get it. Perhaps I never will. Kieran is in Canterbury. Kieran, what would you like to say?
Yeah, what I want to say on this is that actually I don't agree that there's a massive issue that you're making out with this.
Well, it's not me, mate. It's the chair. It's the chair of the relevant select committee from the House of Lords.
So
well, no, you have to get your point right. It's not me that's objecting. It's Lord Evans.
But you're obviously
agreeing with him. I'm agreeing with the chair of the committee.
The point of an advisor is that it provides advice. Is not a compliance manager. So the very nature of the word advice means that the person taking that advice has the ability to choose to take it or...
So who's the compliance manager?
Well, that's what I'm saying. So
I'm saying who is it?
Well, there isn't one, is there?
Right.
So what I'm asking then is, should we have compliance managers to monitor everything that Prime Minister or other cabinet ministers do to then sort of almost steer exactly how they should be doing things, or should we leave it to the people that are elected in those positions?
But this is precisely the point that's been addressed by Lord Evans in his letter to Boris Johnson, saying that the advisor needs to have precisely the powers that you've just reminded us he doesn't have.
So an unelected advisor we want to have...
In the way that judges... Yes, in the way that judges are unelected.
OK. Well, I, along with a lot of people that I speak to, don't agree. And
so
quite frankly, don't care.
Oh, OK. You don't care about the law being broken?
I care about the law being broken. I'm also
you just said you didn't.
About the fact that a Prime Minister, they're not a president. They don't have the type of executive power that someone like Donald Trump would have had. And that someone like Boris Johnson, along with any other Prime Minister, cannot move without scrutiny and it being blown up in all media outlets for people to examine and decide, as well as the judicial system. So you're sort of making out that we're living in this world in this country where we've got Prime Ministers absolutely
Why do you think the last independent advisor resigned?
Don't know.
Well, that's why you don't care, because ignorance is bliss. He resigned because it just did. You've just proved it. You've just said I don't care, and then I've asked you a question that explains why you should care, and you've said that you don't know.
It's about the pandemic. That's what matters to me the very most.
Well, then you must be furious with Boris Johnson.
No, I mean, look at the success of the vaccine rollout alone.
Yes.
Look at what we've done with furlough.
Look how many people died.
Yeah, I know.
And look who said the thing about the bodies piling high in their thousands.
Again, it's exactly my point.
I know. It's awful, isn't it? The facts.
That comment. I mean,
I'm sorry. It's awful.
You know he said that to you, James.
No, but I know that three people are prepared to swear on oath that he did.
Okay, so that's it, is it? You're judged during execution because three people are...
No, they are. And that will be in front of a judge who, guess what, Kieran? Won't have been elected.
But the action
which makes him independent.
So although he might have said that,
all right, mate.
Lockdown did happen. So what does it
before
matter?
You go, just on a broad question, with the current death toll in this country standing at 127,480, the fifth highest in the world, at what point, how high would that have to have been before you would ring a radio station to say he hasn't done a very good job? What sort of number would we be looking at?
No idea. What that tells me is that
please answer the question, mate. Please answer the question.
With the global pandemic,
please answer the question.
120,000 deaths.
How high would it have to be before you decided that, like the governments of America, Brazil, Mexico, and India last year, we didn't do a very good job? How high would it have to go?
I suppose if it would have to be at the point where we've got a healthcare that's collapsed,
just a number,
vaccines that are not rolling out.
Just a number.
I don't know. That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense to say to me how many.
But you've said it does, because if you can say that number is not high enough for it to be a problem, I can come back and say how high would it have to be for you to conclude that he'd done a bad job?
It would have to be a lot higher.
How high?
It would have to mean that the people aren't getting their vaccines, that health treatment.
It's not what I'm
isn't
asking
being
you
delivered.
about. How high would it have to be, the death toll from last year and the beginning of this year, the biggest spike, of course, coming as a direct result of the policy confusion over Christmas? How high before you thought, gosh, actually, maybe he's not the Messiah, maybe he's a very naughty boy?
It wouldn't be the number that directs it. It would be what's been done.
Yes,
So
those words don't make any sense, do they? Just give me the number.
No.
Because you don't care. It's
Of course I care.
11:32. Of course you care. It's 11:32. Holly Harris is here with the headlines. It is 11:37. Do you remember Stephen Yaxley Lennon, the artist formerly known as Tommy Robinson? It is just under 2 years since he appeared at the Old Bailey and attracted some 2,000 or 3,000 supporters while I think he was facing some charges. Hard to keep up, wasn't it? But he's been back in court this week and nobody's noticed, which I think is horribly unfair on the fella. So I'm delighted to tell you that James Dolman, who toils chiefly for the Byline Times, among many others, has been sitting in the press gallery. Have you been the only one there, James?
No, at one point there was 3 of us.
Oh, really?
Myself, the Press Association, and a person who I assume was a Tommy Robinson supporter writing for his Telegram channel.
OK, but fair to say that is quite a decline from the last time he was in court.
Indeed, yes. I was there the last time he was in court. Press gallery was packed. Katie Hopkins was there.
Oof.
Various other
You're not really allowed to mention her name on this programme. You should have been warned. You should have been warned in advance.
I beg your pardon.
No, that's quite all right. That's quite all right. It's easy mistake to make. So tell us a little bit about the case that is currently unfolding in the Royal Courts of Justice. It's a civil case accusing him of defamation. What does that mean, and what's been happening? Because I gather he's been a bit unhappy about the lack of media coverage, and I thought I'd do my bit to help.
It's a very simple case, really. I don't remember back in October 2018, there was a video circulating of a young Syrian school kid being bullied. And it hit the news big time because he was waterboarded there. The bully was pouring water over his face. I'm sure it's something probably featured at the time. The video went viral. I hate to say things like that these days. The video was widely circulated. And there was a crowdfunding campaign which raised, I think, £130,000 for the family. So far, that's a feel-good story. But then Mr. Robinson popped up on his Facebook channel, his then Facebook channel, of 1 million followers, to say that the young boy Jamal was in fact a thug, a bully, attacked girls, and when a young Englishman stands up to protect him, he becomes the scapegoat. You know, this is totally wrong. To advance his anti-Muslim agenda, as said, the prosecution said, or Jamal's lawyer said, and he's being sued for libel for defamation over those comments.
And he's conducting his own defence, I gather.
Yes, Mr. Robinson, in a pre-trial hearing, said he was bankrupt and divorced, had no resources at all, and was forced to defend himself.
An awful lot of people donated an awful lot of money to him. I'm surprised to learn he's bankrupt. That's something we can certainly look into after the verdict has been delivered. What has unfolded in court? I mean, the case is over now. We're just waiting for the judgment to come in.
That's correct. Essentially, the case took 4 days. The case for Jamal was very simple. They just said, Jamal gave evidence, was cross-examining Mr. Robinson. Jamal's father gave evidence. Tommy Robinson had 5 witnesses, all of whom were school children. No teachers, no officials from the school. The school children, who we won't name, of course. Generally, it was was the one who carried out the attack, who said he was provoked by Jamal. There was a young girl who said she'd been attacked by Jamal with a hockey stick. But there was no witnesses to... It was almost all hearsay, apart from the young woman who said that Jamal had hit her with a hockey stick. It was all hearsay evidence. There was no direct evidence, no documents, and no teachers, whatever. So the lawyers of Jamal made this very strong point that, where's the documentation? If these things happened, why didn't the school write them down? It'd be impossible for a teacher, the risk they would be taking if one of their pupils was assaulted and they never put it in a report or anything like that.
Quite also, a surreal experience for the judge as well. And I know he's had to explain on several occasions why certain questions were inadmissible. Have you ever seen anything like that in court before?
No. It was there were. I mean, to be fair, the judge also complimented Mr. Robinson at the end.
Yes,
and said, you've done a reasonably good job in your defence and you've stuck by the rules. But there was a comic moment when the judge referred Mr. Robertson to a document, one of his own documents and evidence, and he'd left it at home. So the other side had to hand in their copy of his own document.
Well, you know, it's 3 years at law school, not necessarily a waste of anybody's time. And finally, the fake news element. You mentioned comic moments. I did enjoy what one of the, I think 4 people have been attending in support of him, and one of them shouted fake news at someone they thought was a journalist who turned out not to be a journalist.
Yeah, it was just some random chap walking out of the Royal Courts of Justice was accosted with a man with a camera phone for his YouTube video.
Dreadful
and said you are fake news.
Yes.
And sports supporters were all filming each other, which I found rather strange as well.
Jay Solomon, we may catch up with you again once the judgment has been handed down, but I felt, you know, in the interest of fairness and balance, that it would be my my duty, my reluctant duty to step up and provide some of the coverage that the artist formerly known as Tommy Robinson believes has been lacking from his current adventures. 11:42 is the time. Back to this question of what's the point of having an advisor on ethics if the person whose ethics are in question is free to dismiss any findings and investigations? The very simple point made by the chair of the Standards Committee, Lord Evans, is that they believe that the advisor should be able to operate with independence and transparency, and that the latest revelations from Boris Johnson's Downing Street are that the advisor will still lack the authority to initiate investigations. I've said it before and I'll say it again. It's never mattered before because you've never had the prospect, I don't think, and I bow to precedent on this one, of a Prime Minister commissioning a report and then ignoring it if he doesn't like its findings. It's never happened before in the context of independent advisors on the ministerial code. So that's why it needs to change. You can change it back to how it is now once we've got through this curious period in parliamentary history and we don't have someone in charge who prorogues Parliament, misleads the Queen and promises to break international law at the first opportunity. But until we do have some sort of norms and standards back in place, I guess it's the job of select committees, and they must be pinching themselves to work out whether this is some sort of fever dream or what's actually happening. Then they need... as Lord Kerslake, a former head of the Civil Service, says, then Johnson needs to adopt the full recommendations of the Standards Committee. The fact that he has not will raise concerns for the Prime Minister whenever questions about a minister arise. So there's now 3 inquiries into the flat that no one cares about. Michael's in Derry. Michael, what would you like to say?
How you doing, James?
I'm pretty good. I've come to you quite late, so you're going to have to be brief.
Right. I was the cognitive dissonance that sort of exists at the moment, I think, speaks to a loss of prestige that maybe the British are feeling, you know, from after the post sort of Brexit referendum, and I speak to that and if you go back to Ireland and the pre-Celtic Tiger era in the late 80s.
Yeah.
So in the 90s, you had a character called Charlie Hockey.
Charlie Hockey. I knew you were going to do this. I don't know why. I just had a little suspicion this was going to be the direction of travel. Go on, just.
And he you know, I can see a parallel there.
Can
where, you know, Ireland back then was, you got to put it in context. It was poor. It was socially backward.
Yeah.
It didn't, you know, and there was this sort of lovable rogue who was openly corrupt, who was getting shirts made in Milan and charged to the Exchequer, and ran his own and had a private estate and a helicopter to take him to it. But it was, you know, it didn't have the trappings of you know, business or anything. He wasn't like a Michael Heseltine or something like that.
And because I'm not familiar with this period in Irish history. What would you offer up as you give the kind of? I mean, you heard the last fella. You heard the last caller. There must have been a lot of that in Ireland at the time. I don't care what he does. He's my man, so I'm behind him.
Exactly. That was it, and I think it speaks to that. There wasn't a lot of, you know, Ireland hadn't gone through that gaining of prestige that it got from the Celtic Tiger and Riverdance and all those things that were to come, and that The analogy I would use is that if you see two escalators in a shopping mall, there's the up and down.
Yes.
Ireland was just about to step on the first step of the up escalator.
But the people that support the current Prime Minister don't feel that the country is denuded or diminished. They think that Britain has been made great again, and reality might challenge that perception. But
I don't know if they do, but they tell themselves that they believe that.
Yeah,
but I would say that Britain's on the top and getting onto the down escalator. It's the exact, it's the inverse.
But I don't think that the people we're talking about who are in their millions. I mean, we need to make that absolutely clear. There's a danger of this show sounding a little bit smug. I mean, we're very, very much, I think, still in the minority, albeit that reality shouldn't be a matter of majority and minority. It should be a matter of objectivity. I don't know that they do feel that the country is on a downward spiral and that Johnson is some sort of standard bearer for whatever it is they think he's a standard bearer for. But I don't know. I shall give it some thought. I need to find out more about the hockey era and the impunity, the free pass, which is what yesterday's programme was about. Today's programme is a similar theme, but it's not about why you choose to turn off your moral compass when you're discussing this man, as many people clearly do. But it's about why you don't think any rules should apply to him, why you don't think he should be bound to take the advice, the guidance, the counsel of the people he's even appointed himself. I mean, just think about that for 1 minute. Who's going to mark your homework, James? Oh, Keith is. But Keith's your mate. Yeah, I know. I like him. He's solid. You can't question Keith's probity. He's a good man. And if Keith comes back and says you're a wrong 'un and you need to cough for this, I say, oh, no, he's not that reliable. If he comes back and finds that I've done something wrong, then I shall completely ignore him. And then, people like my equivalents of Kieran, people who think that the sun shines out of my bottom, regardless of all the evidence to the contrary, and there's nowhere near as much as there is in Boris Johnson's case, but I'm sure there's plenty if you look hard enough, then that they'd be ringing in to LBC to say, no, it's absolutely fine. Keith can't, Keith's just an advisor. He might have been appointed by James to investigate James and come back and said James has done wrong, but James is perfectly entitled to say, nothing to see here. I'm flushing that report down the same Lulu Little lavatory that the report into Priti Patel's bullying mysteriously disappeared. It's 11:48. It's 11:53, and I owe you a sincere and profound apology. I have missed the most important question of the day while discussing the desirability of Clobber or Kit and Caboodle purchased from John Lewis, and doing so on a Thursday. The big question of the moment, the one to which we all want answers, and I currently don't have any, is this: will the Mystery Hour board game be for sale in John Lewis? It certainly looks that way at this stage in proceedings, but I shall keep you posted on that front. I mention it because it's now 11:53, which means Mystery Hour's around the corner, which means I should shut up and crack on. Peter is in Croydon. Peter, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. You said earlier that you know at least 3 people...
No, not me, Peter. It's the political editor of the ITV, the political editor of the BBC, and the editor of the Daily Mail.
Excellent. Well, okay, they haven't been mentioned yet. So up until the point that those sources have been mentioned, isn't that equivalent to fake news?
No.
Why?
Well,
it's not authorised.
No, you can accuse them of lying. Of course you can. You're perfectly entitled to do that.
No, I'm not even saying they're lying.
Well, then it's not fake news, then, is it?
No. Up until the point that someone is named, it's not even worth talking about. Yesterday, a guy accused you of something.
Why the Electoral Commission? Why the Electoral Commission investigating?
Well, they haven't mentioned the source.
And also, listen, I'm going to go back to the call yesterday because you mention it.
Yeah.
If I had been having suicidal thoughts, it wouldn't be an accusation.
I'm not saying that, James.
No, but that's what the caller yesterday said, and I'm in a really uncomfortable position because that shouldn't be an insult. Our man yesterday, Mike in Ware, clearly thought it was, and there's some nonsense about me on some Facebook page somewhere, and I'm uncomfortable being this self-referential. But you need to listen because you've brought it up now, and I didn't.
Go.
So using the word accusation there is horrible, because what he did, and I hope it was unintentionally, was kind of make the case that if I had, and quite why my mental health would be suffering during what has been by far the most incredible period of my entire career, is a question that probably hasn't been answered on whatever weird Facebook page he's knocking about on. It can't be seen as an insult or an accusation, Peter, to accuse somebody, to use your own word, of having that.
That's
So
what I'm saying. What I'm saying, that's not even the issue for me.
Well,
the
that's
issue
the
for me
issue
is this,
raised.
right? Are sources that aren't identified, it's equivalent to fake news. That's what Trump was talking about.
No, but it really isn't.
I'm not even a Trump supporter.
No,
I'm not even a
but you
Trump
can keep
supporter,
talking,
right?
Peter, but you're not making any sense, because...
But nor are you.
Well, no, I am, Peter, because
you're
you
talking
have...
about sources that aren't mentioned. So what is that? All the TV programs and radio stations are based on nonsense.
So when will Boris Johnson sue? When will he sue?
The evidence.
When will he
Where
sue?
is the evidence?
When will he sue?
Why should he take part in that debate? It's a false debate.
When will he sue?
You voted for the Iraqi war, right, on no evidence.
Nobody voted. Nobody voted for the Iraqi war except people in Parliament.
Did you not say that you
Well, why are we talking about the
war?
Iraqi war?
Because there was no evidence. Again, you have a situation of no evidence.
Right.
If you've got a source, name the source. Why do you
Okay.
keep talking about sources that aren't... You could say anything. I could say
Because
anything about
the minute they're
Johnson.
named...
Anything at all.
Yes, of course you could. And if you had double-sourced it as a professional journalist, then you would have a very different case from ringing up a radio station and saying something you've just made up.
Johnson.
Do you not understand the difference between... Please listen for a minute, because I can help you if you let me. Do you understand the difference between professional journalists?
That's not professional journalism. You're doing down the profession. Why are you saying that? That's not a journalist. No source.
Right, okay,
No
so
source. No source. No name. Name the source.
Oh,
You said.
Lord above, Peter.
You mentioned-
Listen,
you
okay,
mentioned
mate.
you're doffing your cap.
Tugging my forelock.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Whatever you
yeah,
call it.
yeah.
I call it kneeling or bowing or whatever
You
you
can
want to do.
call it what you
to
want. I'm
somebody
just
who
explaining
hasn't
to
got
you how the world
hasn't got-
works.
the world doesn't work the way you'd like
The
it to work,
difference
'cause people aren't
between
stupid.
three
Name the source.
extremely prominent journalists...
No newspapers prominent. There you go again,
crikey.
kneeling down to people again because they're prominent. Where is the source? Simply name the source.
The
That's
source
evidence.
is in Downing Street. There are
Everything
three
led.
people in
Everything
Downing Street contacted independently by three journalists. You can respect them or not respect them as much as you please.
It's the source. What is the name of the source? You know what I'm talking about.
I don't know what you're talking... Well, I know what you
do,
think
you've
you're
been
talking
educated,
about.
you've been educated.
No, you think you've got
Everything
some
should
sort of
be-
zinging
it should-
point here, because I'm not going
I
to
have
say
got
the
a
name...
zinging point.
No, I
I
know you
have,
think
and
you
you
have, and
you
if you
can't
listened for a
argue.
minute...
Well,
you,
name-
I can't argue if I
Sorry.
can't speak, Peter, but if you
Okay,
listened for a
okay.
minute, I'll tell you exactly what happened at the Daily Mail on Sunday, shall I?
Yes.
When they were making the decision on whether or not to splash with this story for Monday, okay? Lawyers came into the process. Exactly the same thing happened at ITV. Exactly the same thing happened at the BBC. And the lawyers said, before we go public with this story, we need to check this, and this. We need to establish that the story is double-sourced. We need to establish our faith in the integrity and the probity of those sources. And we need to establish our trust in what those sources are telling us. And all three sets of extremely highly paid, highly respected lawyers, so forget about the journalists, they all concluded that the criteria for publication had been met. Does that help you understand? I've got a horrible feeling it doesn't.
No. What is the name of the source?
Oh,
With all of that...
It's HP, mate. It's coming up to 12 noon. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where my lectures in Journalism 101 and indeed media law have now come to a crashing and unsavoury end, because it's time for Mystery Hour, your weekly opportunity to achieve the sort of satisfaction and... Well, actually, no, but that was a very good example of Mystery Hour. If you had rung in and said, how can these publications publish these stories without naming the sources, I would have provided you there with a absolutely definitive answer. And the question would have been, what are your qualifications? And I would say, well, media law training, 20-odd years in the industry, and personal knowledge of many of the key personnel involved in publishing these stories. Keith, would that have earned a round of applause? Come on, mate. If that doesn't qualify for a Ray Liotta, nothing does.